Hey y'all, welcome to Coyote Trapping School Podcast, episode number 14. Today's episode, we're going to talk about incidental and non-target catches. You know, that's something that, as a trapper, if you're going to, if you trap for any length of time and cover much ground, you're going to deal with at some point or another in your trapping career. And that means different things depending on where you're at, what you're targeting, and what your local relationships are, but your regulations are. So, you know, that could be as simple as, I mean, on my trap line, you know, I set predator traps for coyotes, fox, and bobcats, but I'm going to catch possums and skunks and coons sometimes. Those are non-target catches, incidental catches for me, but there's no real issue with that because there's no regulations around that. Those are fur bearers. They fall in line with the other trapping regulations, and there's no issue with me harvesting those as part of my regular trap line. And depending on the timing of when I'm doing that, so in Georgia, coyotes and beavers are considered nuisance species, and they can be trapped all year long. But those other fur bearer species like fox and bobcat can't. So if I'm trapping in the summer for coyotes for personal reasons and I catch a bobcat, well then that's an incidental catch that I've got to release because the regulations require that. And so that's the first kind of thing that we'll talk about is kind of from a regulation standpoint. And different, like as always, you know, be sure to check your local regulations because it can vary a lot from state to state. And so overall in Georgia, and I think in a lot of places in the South, the regulations are pretty lax. There's a healthy population of most fur bearers, so from that standpoint, from a protection standpoint, we don't really see some of the same issues that you see in some of the other states outside of the Southeast. So, and kind of what I'm talking about. A lot of states, it seems bobcats and otters seem to be kind of the two that, if there are issues, you know, not all states allow just wholesale open season on bobcats and otters during trapping season like the southern states do. So in Georgia, when the season rolls around December 1, I can trap all fur bearers. There's no limits. But in some areas, it's a permit for certain, in some states, not in Georgia, but in some states, you know, they may have permits that you have to apply for to catch a bobcat, or a fisher or martin, maybe fisher more so than martin, but I know that comes to mind as one as well. Fishers that you may have a permit for, and it can only be one. You can only catch one per season, or you know there's a certain quota, and so if you catch them, you have to check it in with your state wildlife agency, and once a certain quota is hit, you know then there's no more harvesting of those animals. And even, you know, even some areas, other incidental catches that we don't necessarily, or that I usually don't necessarily think about, lynx in certain, you know, kind of the Canadian border states. Lynx can be one, and in more states, bears and cougars are others that can definitely have an opportunity to get in your traps, and then you've got a major issue that you've got to do something about, you know, depending on your regulations and depending on how your state wants to handle that, you know, and I guess how personally you feel comfortable handling that. I don't know what the regulations are in some states, or even in my state, I guess, is, you know, if I were to trap a bear, because there are bears running around in Georgia, if I were to catch one, I don't know if I would. That's something worth looking up. And that's one that you probably would want you may want to turn over to your local wildlife agency, because that's probably no small feat is cutting a bear loose out of a trap, or a cougar for that matter, you know, regardless of what tools you got. I'd probably at least want a buddy helping. So in those scenarios, which, like I said, the more common scenario for some of those, the northern and midwestern states, is bobcats and otters. You know, there's states that don't allow the harvest of those, or during a specific time frame that may be outside of the regular time frame. And so initially your first line of defense is to try to set to avoid making those catches. So if you're putting in predator sets, you probably, and I'm just assuming because I've never had to do this, but you probably, especially if there were some bobcats in your area, you may try to limit the amount of bobcat glands or lures and baits you use that have cat glands, or limit the use of urine. I on my trap line, as just a general predator trap line, I use cat gland and cat urine pretty heavily from time to time, because I want to catch. I don't mind catching bobcats, but also coyotes are attracted to bobcat scent, and so other things are. So, I try to leverage that for multiple critters, and so but when you're looking at the opposite, then you may want to not use that to try to make sure that you don't have those issues with catching those. And even with that, bobcats is kind of an easy one, because you're going to be catching them in footholds, and you can release them out of footholds. Otters, not so much, because if you're catching otters, incidentally, you're probably catching them in beaver sets. And most beaver sets are designed as killer sets, so whether that's in a conibear or whether that's in a foothold or a drowner. So that's an area, and that's a tough one, because the majority of otters that I catch are in beaver sets. I mean, there are some areas where I'll try to target, and I'll see some good otter sign and I'll try to sit around it, but otters, the way otters travel and cycle in and out of areas, it can be, you may not see a lot of sign around an area that an otter may be using, like a beaver lodge, for instance, that's used by beavers, and otter comes through, he's liable to get up on that lodge and mess all around it. And so that's one where you've got less, you may have less leeway around trying to avoid those, outside of, if you see a specific otter toilet, then you try to avoid using that location and use a different location, and maybe you try, instead of opting for like crossovers, because that would be a big one that I could see. Crossovers on dams a lot of times is definitely an otter hotspot as well as beavers. And so instead of keying in on some of those more natural travel routes with beavers, which are very responsive to castor gland lures and foreign beaver smells, kind of competition related, they're very, very responsive to those. So instead of setting the travel routes, setting obvious slides and crossovers, you may default to setting more of lured and baited sets, which is still should keep your beaver catch good and positive, but may not have the incidental otters. So that's one thing. Like I said, that bobcats and anything in a foothold trap and a predator type trap is relatively easy, versus like otters, something that if you catch them, odds are you're catching them in a killer set. And in that scenario, if you make that catch, then your only option is you've got to self-report. And I think, I've never been in the situation, but I think most game agencies and most folks that you deal with are understanding, and that's something that they know is part of trapping, part of the job. And I'm sure they want to make sure that you're not specifically targeting that catch, but realistically, if you were, and if you made the catch, you're probably not going to report it, because if you're targeting it for a reason. So that's definitely something to keep in mind. It's getting into trapping, getting interested in trapping is not as straightforward as getting some traps from your hardware store and setting them out back. It can be, but sooner or later you're going to run into some of these other issues, and so it helps to be prepared for that on the front end. And getting to like bobcats and even your cougars and bears, that's something that you need to have a plan, at least would have considered and thought about ahead of time, so that if I catch a bear up here, I got to call my game warden, or I'm going to call somebody, or call my neighbor Joe and help me get this thing released. And so that's one thing too, that like in Georgia we're required to carry a catch pole, and so I carry a this catch-all brand catch pole, which is kind of a higher end catch pole. It's a very easy to handle and nice handling, kind of professional grade catch pole. It's costly, but when I originally got it, I was doing some live market trapping, and so when you're handling coyotes and foxes on a regular basis and you're using that catch pole a lot, I liked having the ease of use that one, it's got the way it works. You just pull you got your cable on the back end that you pull to tighten your loop, and then this is your release. It's just this knob on the end that's spring loaded, so you pull it on the back to loosen your loop. And versus some of the other ones, the cheaper ones that have just got that T handle and a little kind of lever lock bar, that stuff can get bumped pretty easy, and if you're not trying to release but you're trying to handle that coyote and put him in a pen or something like that, it could put you in a pickle in a hurry if you're not prepared. So but getting back to that, our regulations require us to carry a catch pole, and if you are just trapping for the fur market and you don't intend to be handling a lot of live animals, then even a homemade catch pole with some PVC pipe and some cable, and I think you could probably get by. I don't know, I shouldn't say that, but there is the option also of using like a big piece of plywood with some handles and a notch in the bottom, so that you can put it over the animal and stretch that animal out far enough to where you put its foot in that notch, so you've got access to the trap, but that animal's blocked by that plywood from getting to you. Just use caution if you've never done that before, because it is releasing a trapped animal is definitely it's an opportunity for disaster, I guess you could say. That animal is mad, and you're up there all up in his business, restraining it, and so I've released some animals from on some of the videos that I've shown on my trap line. I've released animals, and coons in particular. I've released a few of those, and I think I even said it on the video that I know this probably looks. I can't remember how I put it, but probably looks like I'm using excessive force, maybe. But I kind of am, because I don't want to get bit or scratched by a raccoon. So I try to, when I'm doing that, when I'm releasing that animal, you put your choke stick around his head and neck, and I tighten it down to where I know he's not moving, and then I try to stretch him out and pull his head away from that trap and pin his head down. And whether that means pin his head down and stand on the catch pole with one foot and release the trap foot with my other two hands, or however you work that. Just if you're in that scenario and you've never done that before, just use caution, because those animals can turn on a dime, and you don't want to. I don't want anybody to be needing a rabies shot or worse, stitches or anything like that, because they were messing around trying to release an animal. And you could see some of that if you look at some of the YouTube videos and stuff of Good Samaritans releasing animals from traps. I think of one in particular, and it's been years since I saw this, but a couple of guys out in like Nebraska or somewhere, it was very plains looking, and there was a bobcat trapped, I think by around a fence row, and these guys are out there thinking they're doing a good deed by releasing that bobcat, and as soon as they get that sucker released, he jumps on that one guy's back, and it's, I don't know, if people need to mind their own business in some cases, and what people don't realize is that that's illegal. In most states, it's illegal for somebody else to tamper with your traps if they're legally set. So, but that being said, also in all the times when I've turned an animal loose, they've always run the other way. You let them out and you get out there with the catch pole and cut them loose and, you know, make sure they got a good clear line of travel. They don't always go that way, but they got the option there where they don't have to go through you to get to that, to get out. But kind of got off on a tangent there, rambling. But know whether your state requires you to carry a catch pole, and if not, at least have some kind of plan of how you're going to release those animals. And like I said, if you're in a scenario where maybe you catch a bob, I mean, I've had bobcats or foxes more so than bobcats, but I've had animals killed in traps before by like coyotes, for instance. So if you were to have a bobcat that was in a trap and was killed, you know, that's going to be a scenario probably like the otters, where you need to call your whoever your local game agency is, whether that's calling the wildlife biologist or calling the game warden and reporting that, just so you aren't getting into any trouble or any issues. And that's, you know, that's something that helps in the population tracking and the setting of harvest limits, is knowing that how many animals that we're catching incidentally when we're trapping, and you know, because that can help justify and shore up, you know, population numbers. Because otherwise, you know, a lot of these state game agencies, the fur bear biologists get the least amount of funding because there's a lot fewer trappers than there are deer hunters, and so they're, you know, making, and I'm not knocking them, don't get me wrong, because they're making the best decisions they can in most cases with the information they have, but they don't have a lot of information. I mean, how the heck on any state, how are you going to get a good census of bobcat populations in the state or otter populations? You know, that's not something that you can do like one of the ways that keep track of deer activity is with deer car collisions that get reported. Nobody reports running over an otter on the road, you know. That can play into it too, reporting not only of trying to cover yourself and keep yourself out of trouble, but also, you know, providing as much information as we can to our wildlife agencies, so that hopefully, you know, if they start seeing a trend of, hey, we're catching more bobcats incidentally on trap lines, these trappers are, well, maybe our bobcat populations are higher than we thought they were, and, you know, maybe we can support harvest or increased harvest, something like that. So, and I would say that goes, you know, that reporting, regardless of whether you're making non-target catches or not, or incidental catches that you need to report. I think most all states probably have a reporting function for trappers to report their harvests, and as a general trend, how they see fur bear populations going. And that's something I've been meaning to do at our last convention. Our fur bear biologist gave an update, and an update on how many animals were harvested, and that'd make a good podcast, the stuff that he talked about, how many animals were harvested, how many trappers were licensed, how many new trappers were licensed, and you know, general trends that trappers were seeing. Because I think one of the trends in Georgia, I have to go back and check, but was that coyote populations were kind of declining a little bit, which would probably surprise some people. But anyway, it's important, like I said, to give those folks as much reliable information as we can, because, you know, without trapper numbers, that's just it's a shot in the dark anyways on some of these wildlife population estimates. But you know, at least as trappers, you know, we give some hard numbers and hard data that, you know, if there's so many trappers out catching so many bobcats for over so many catch nights, then, you know, this may be what our bobcat population is. I don't know. Again, that's kind of got off on a tangent, but another portion of the incidental and non-target catches is going to be domestic animals. So there's a high chance, unless you're trapping very remote areas, that at some point you're going to run across, you're going to catch somebody's dog. Probably, I don't know that I've ever caught a domestic cat, honestly, in a trap, but I've definitely caught some dogs, and that's something that helps to be prepared for. And really, catching a dog is kind of a non-event. I say that hesitantly. You know, most of the traps that we use and the tactics that we as trappers use nowadays, as long as you're catching them in foothold traps, you know, there's not going to be damage or severe damage or anything like that to the foot. You know, you're going to be able to turn that dog loose and he's probably gonna limp home, but at least he's gonna limp home, and he's gonna lick his paw, and he's gonna be back to normal in a couple days. And a lot of times it's relatively easy to let those animals out of the trap, because a lot of times dogs, they're kind of used to being restrained anyway, so they don't make a big catch circle. They just kind of, once they're trapped and they realize they're stuck there, they'll just sit down and wait. And when you come up, if you come up reasonably and slowly, and trying to kind of gain the dog's trust, so to speak, they can, you can usually let them out. I typically, personally, honestly, I've always got my catch pole, so I usually use it and don't rely on trusting the dog. I may not be as rough with them as I may be a raccoon or something, but just because the one thing that I've seen is, that animal can be very laid back and mellow. As soon as you grab that trap that its foot's in, that can cause a change of, that's my sore foot, that's my hurt foot, what are you doing? That hurts, whatever. It may not be that the dog's meaning to, but when you grab that foot, and if it's a little tender, his first instinct may be to bite you. So use caution there, but that's really usually straightforward, and that's, in general, when you're scouting a trap line and you're looking either at aerial photos or just out riding, that's definitely one thing that I always try to keep in mind. Is I try to be cautious about how close I set to houses or neighborhoods, or whatever. Try to be on the lookout if I see some dogs running around, or dogs up on the porch of the house, a quarter mile down the road. Well, those owners probably don't realize it, but those dogs are going to range, and they're going to get out and do some traveling at night, and there's a good chance they'll cover that quarter mile and come check out your bait and lure at some point. So whether you catch them or not is one thing, but that's the biggest thing is just knowing, being prepared that probably am going to catch something sooner or later. I'm going to catch a dog, dog, bobcat, something that I need to release. And I would say even I pretty regular. If I catch a small red fox, small raccoon, small bobcat, I usually turn those loose. It's not like our fur prices are so outrageously good that I just need to harvest everything I can. And it's more of an advantage for me to let that young red fox or whatever go and prime up and grow and get a little bigger, because for us in the South, our fur prices aren't that great to begin with, and if we can, the one thing that can improve and kind of help our fur prices in general is, getting bigger, better quality specimens, and so, a little bit longer, usually the larger sizes bring a higher dollar. So I just wanted to go through that, because that's something that, a new trapper might not think about, but hopefully you don't get that rude awakening right away, but you very well can. I had one instance, maybe the second or third, I think it was the second year that I started trapping. I started trapping when I was in high school, so I was young, and I got permission to trap on a 500-acre piece of property. And man, I had some traps set off on a pond dam, kind of right in the middle of the property. I was not near anybody, and I actually that set, I caught a bobcat, my first bobcat ever. I caught that bobcat in, and I was super pumped about it. And then I went back in there the next day, and the trap was sprung and out of the bed, and I could tell I had caught something, but it was gone. And so I just figured maybe I had a toe catch or something to pull out. No big deal. And then later on that afternoon, the landowner called me and said, "Man, you kind of got me in trouble." And I said, "Do what?" And I said, "Yeah, the neighbor has rabbit dogs. His rabbit dogs got out running without permission. They got out and they were running on this property that I was trapping and got caught in one of my traps. Well, the owner of the dogs was no friend of trappers, typically. And unfortunately, a lot of times, folks that run dogs, especially if they're old school, they've been around trappers and been around traps and stuff, and they do not see... They don't have our perspective on how harmless traps are. And so they, like I said, they typically, old school dog people coonsmen, houndsmen in general, coons, rabbit dogs, rabbit runners, guys like that are not big fans of trapping. And so the guy that owned these beagles wasn't a fan of trapping. He called the game warden. Well, the game warden came out there, and he looked at my trap. My trap was legal. I had it tagged. Everything was legal. So I never got a call. Nobody ever said anything to me. But because the game warden came out there, he contacted the landowner, and the landowner verified that I had permission to be out there. And so it really kind of rubbed me wrong because, I was perfectly legal. This guy's dog was on property that he didn't have permission to be on. He came over to get the dog, was trespassing, and called the game warden on me. And I'm the one that, kind of had to go through got my trap dug up and everything else. So, unfortunately, things like that, as a trapper, it kind of seems like sometimes you have a bullseye on your back just because people are so unfamiliar and so uneducated about trapping. And so I guess that's ultimately my point, is that as a trapper, you got to be ready to face some of these challenges that are going to come up because people don't know what you're doing. They don't realize that, you can stick your hand into this trap and it's not going to break your bones. They just see the Wile E. Coyote trap with the bear claw teeth on it and think that you're just out there to maim and harm and cruel. And so anyway, I think that's enough of that. Like I said, just be prepared. At some time or another, you're going to catch a non-target or incidental. Have a plan, whether that's using a piece of board, using a catch pole, what have you, and be safe, because it is an opportunity to get hurt if you're not paying attention and not being careful. But otherwise, it's don't by any means let any of this deter you from trapping. It's all part of it. It's going to happen, but that gives you an opportunity to try to help educate people, maybe, or for the most part, nobody's ever going to know if a neighbor's dog gets caught and you turn his dog loose. He's never going to know that dog got caught in a trap. He's probably never even going to realize that the dog's limping. So anyway, I know some of y'all are trapping. I will be trapping next week. I know I was a day late getting this podcast out, but I'll be trapping next week and have some more podcasts and hopefully some trapping video coming up real soon. So I appreciate y'all following along, and I'm pumped. Keep me posted on how y'all's trapping season is going. And good luck. We'll see you next time.